Great. Okay, we're here. We made it. How are you doing, Alec?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Kanoa?
Good. I'm good. I'm good. Well, thanks for joining us today. I'm Kanoa. I'm not touching my mic. I'm Kanoa, and I run Abundant Masculinities, which is a project that creates space for men to identify, heal from the wounds of patriarchy while creating healthier masculinities alongside their peers. And I'm here with my good friend Alec Browndridge.
Hey everyone, I am Alec Browndridge. I grew up across the states and also in Cape Town, South Africa. And this diverse childhood experience led me to do a lot of different stuff. Have worked in education equity, data, mindfulness, social emotional learning, etc. For me, the big thing is holding space for people to grow, to learn, and to heal. Outside of my work, you can find me dancing, doing yoga, being in nature, spending time with my beautiful community of friends and family.
Amazing. Cool. Yeah, and we're here because there's a lot of overlap between the work that we do. We talk a lot about healing and community building. We got to meet through community, through mutual friends at their wedding, and I got the opportunity to DJ your wedding to your lovely wife, Kimberly, who I love.
You did a great job DJing.
Yeah, oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, and since then, we've supported each other since being laid off, which has been, well, I don't know, how's it been for you?
Definitely challenging. It's the first time being in a space since graduating college that I didn't have a job really.
Yeah.
And so it's been a lot of self-reflection, a lot of both this feelings of hope and excitement, but also apathy and what's I'm gonna do. So that's why I'm at that. What about you?
Yeah, same. The way I've been describing it to folks is being fun employed without the fun. But it does, offer a lot of time to reflect. And I think, being laid off is particularly hard on men because of that pressure around being breadwinners and being the primary financial contributors to our families. And so, yeah, and I think speaking of those, very gendered expectations, let's get into it because we're already in it. So I want to ask Alec, who are your people? Who are the folks who made you into the man you are today?
Yeah, thanks, Kanoa, for asking that. So for the people who made me to the man I am today, I look at several different groups of people. First would be Black men, especially, and not just Black men in the States, but also from the global Black male experience. But for me, first, my dad has always been so important, so influential in how I see myself as a man, and especially as a Black man. He really both my parents, my mom is actually not Black, she's Arab and white, and so but my parents really intentionally raised my brother and I to identify as Black, and as Black boys, as Black men, knowing that's how society would see us, especially in the U.S. And so my dad really trying to influence his pride in who we are, our background, our history, the shared experience of struggle, but also of strength and intelligence. For example, every day when we said goodbye to him to go to school, we would always say, "Stay smart, stay strong, stay Black, love you, Jack." And so for me, that's a really important part of my identity as a man, is this idea of being intelligent, taking time to think, but also being strong, being resilient, and stuff like that. And then even more than that, my dad. It's my parents raised my brother and I with these the heroes, the people that our parents talked about were Black men across history that fought for social justice and rights. So from Arthur Ashe, who was the first Black male tennis player to win an Open, who was an advocate during the AIDS crisis, and unfortunately died from AIDS, was big in the anti-apartheid struggle. So people like him, or also like Archbishop Desmond Tutu in South Africa, who was the spiritual leader of the anti-apartheid struggle. We moved to South Africa partly because of his work of Truth and Reconciliation Commission and all of that. And so we got to be in space with him. He became a family friend. He always called my brother, whose middle name, my younger brother's middle name is Desmond, after Desmond Tutu, his namesake. And so that was this idea of black, my idea of being a man came from all these different black male figures, both people I knew and also people I learned about. And then I also say the next group of how I see myself as a man is other BIPOC male people. So we are in the space right now at the Amala Foundation, where I was brought in partly to be to be a facilitator in this space as a black person, and we started a man of color circle space actually in this loft where we are today. This is the first. Before the pandemic, we were doing it in person, then we went virtual, and so it's kind of cool to come full circle back here. But so like those connections, that community has been really influential and helpful, especially as we able to talk about this intersection of being both a man but also being a person of color in this society. And then the other group that I think really influenced my perspective of who I am as a man is our BIPOC woman of color, and also trans and trans folks. Because for me, as a cisgendered black male growing up, I didn't really, especially as a kid, I didn't really get a chance to be around a lot of women of color, because my mom's not a woman of color really, or not presenting as a woman of color, and I didn't grow up with sisters, and especially in the 90s and early 2000s, not around as many like trans and other experiences of being a person of color. And so in college, that's when I really got a chance to be really in space, but also be led by amazing BIPOC women and other non-binary folks. And it was an opportunity for me to learn a lot about how I come in space as a man, as a black man, that can take up a lot more space, right, than I need to. And so it was really for me learning how to listen more, how to see myself as a support person for these amazing women and non-binary folks.
I'm curious what you think are the gifts of masculinity, if there are any.
Good question, because it is as we've talked before, I've struggled with this idea of masculinity because of the restoration of toxic masculinity, right? And so I kind of try to push away from it. But as I've gotten older too, I've realized it's important to also recognize because I am a man, I can't divorce myself from masculinity, but also look at it more holistically. So for me, I think the first thing I think of is resiliency. For me, resiliency is like the idea of not just being tough and strong. It's like we'll fall down, we'll stumble, but how do you get back up? And it's not just about, like growing up, I realized it's not just about you getting up by yourself, but also relying on your community. And so the great thing about being in this space in Amala is also before the pandemic, I used to co-facilitate a yoga workshop series called Yoga for Men. And it was called Forging Resiliency, because we felt when we created the space that's something that I think can be a gateway for men to start to talk about emotions, because we're not necessarily saying, oh, let's go deep, talk about our sadness, but resiliency allows us, the context of resiliency allows us to take a moment to pause and think, okay, what have we been successful at, but we had to go through a challenge, we fell. It's a framework that allows us to recognize that we all fall, but we can leverage the community around us to lift up, to grow, to be more intentional, more caring, men in our lives with the people we care about. So I think that's the first thing I think about. The second thing, when I think of a gift, I think of standing up to injustice. Not to say women and non-binary folk don't do that, but I think for me, when I think about the people who influenced me to stand up for injustice, like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Dr. King, Nelson Mandela, those types of people were black men, were men who used that strength that we associate with masculinity to demand for justice for all people, right? And especially Archbishop Desmond Tutu he's not a big man. He's not like a physically imposing person, but he still could embody that. You listen to his speeches, his sermons during apartheid that embody the sense of like we're gonna stand up against it, and so that's, I think, what really was another aspect of a gift of masculinity when we think about it. This idea of conviction of spirit. I think there's we talk about men not talk about their emotions a lot, but I think the gift of masculinity is that when we do talk about their emotions, there's something that's powerful about it, that people take a moment in our society, like, oh, this is a beautiful thing, right? Because we don't do as much. So I think it is a gift when we do show our emotions, when we talk about it. It allows us to be vulnerable, because I think it's heard, unfortunately, more than women, because it's not something that happens as often for us. And partly because sometimes our emotions, like our anger, can come off as too much, right? Especially as talking about myself as a black man, anger is seen as a lot, seen as, so make ourselves small. So there's a beauty in being able to express that anger in a way that isn't threatening, that isn't harmful to ourselves, that we can cry, and there's a beauty in that.
Yeah, beautifully said. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're speaking to is so powerful, right? We, I don't think we really acknowledge men enough for showing emotion. When you're right, it is this very particularly vulnerable act of bravery. I think, this pressure to shut yourself down and be stoic is so great, right? So when men step outside of that, I think it's important that we give men their flowers for that, right? Because that's not a small thing for a guy to do. And all of the other identities that you hold just sound like that it makes embodying masculinity so complex, right? And so I'm curious how you're learning to soften your masculinity without losing your sense of identity or sense of self.
That's a good question. I think for me, when I think about it, is learning, really learn that masculinity is not about just being tough or strength. It is, I think for me, just allowing myself to feel all my feels. Even when they are scary to feel, or it's easier to try to just push away. I think for a very simple example, we're talking about being laid off, and there's been multiple times where I get an email from some place I applied to. It's like, unfortunately, we're not gonna keep going, right? Yeah. And I think for me, my initial reaction is it's not to okay. I feel disappointed, but I'm like, okay, I keep going, right? I don't really allow myself to feel sadness. And my therapist actually asked me in therapy the other week, I was like, do you let yourself feel sad? I'm like, not really. I kind of just keep on keeping on. Mm-hmm.
You give yourself that one fleeting moment of disappointment, and then you kind of just...
Yeah. Because I think there's for me at least, there's a fear of being lost in that, right? Mm-hmm. How can I come, am I just gonna be sad and be sadness forever if I let myself just stop? And I think that's to be soft and to be able to trust yourself, to trust myself, to be I can cry, I can be sad, I can be angry, and I won't get lost in that. I won't lose the other parts, the other emotions of myself, the other parts of myself, the resiliency, actually being able to be sad and then coming through that is actually a sign of resiliency. It's a sign of my wholeness as a person / as a man. Same difference, right? Yeah. And so I think for me, when you ask the question about how do we as men be softer, is like first allow us to feel the depth of our emotions. Not just say, I'm say the emotion, the surface of it, but feel the depth and trust that you come through it, and also you're not alone in it. You're not alone in that depthness.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it makes so much sense that we would sort of initially resist that urge to feel the full depth of our emotions, right? When we haven't been given good tools to really process things like discomfort and disappointment and shame, it makes sense that our initial reaction would be like, nope, I don't know, I'm good. So yeah, that resonates a lot. Are there aspects of masculinity that you're still chewing on or wrestling with?
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely parts of that I'm still like, okay, does this? I think for me, when I think of like chewing on this idea of, I think it's this idea like that actually leveraging being tough when needed. Because I think for me, I think I've so much been like, okay, I don't want to, the toughness in that part, like speaking loudly and arguing and being confrontational as part of toxic masculinity is a problem. But sometimes, as we talked about, speaking to injustice, like saying justice it's important to like sometimes be able to be that. Even my partner, my wife Kimberly, sometimes I want you to be able to like to speak up and to be confrontational when someone's doing something harmful, right? And so I think that like be able to, how can I be that in the moment where it doesn't become part of a toxicity, right? I think the next thing for me is just really is the blind spots, right? Because I'm a cisgendered man, I'm gonna have blind spots. Like all of us, when we have a place of privilege or power, we don't see certain things, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think for me, being okay, being able not to become defensive when I do have a blind spot, and able to actually learn from it. And it makes me think of this idea from one of my teachers, Resma Menikam, who wrote My Grandmother's Hands, which is all about healing from racialized trauma, but I think it fits also in the sense of gender trauma and patriarchy, because he talks about this idea of clean versus dirty pain, right? Dirty pain is what we usually react to when something happens, when we make a mistake or we get hurt. We react from the most harmed parts of ourselves. We don't really change ourselves or change the situation. We just like lash out, become defensive. But clean pain is to act from the best parts of ourselves, the already healed parts of ourselves, to basically be able to be with that uncomfortability, to basically be in that discomfort and say, okay, I made a mistake. I perpetuate the patriarchy right now. How can I learn from this? How can I show up to you, Kimberly, as a better partner, as a better ally in the struggle against patriarchy? So for me, these are these are a few things. This idea of like, how can I show up with toughness when it's helpful, when it doesn't perpetuate harm? When can I show up for toughness? How can I show up for both toughness in those individual experiences, when I run into someone who's being toxic, or when I can show that toughness during more the big picture when injustice is happening in the world. So for me, and then this idea of how can I be with my blind spots in a way? How can I be with that discomfort to know that I'm still not perfect? I'm still never going to be the perfect ally to the woman and non-binary folk in my life, because I'm a cisgender man. I'm going to have some blind spots.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, thank you for sharing all of that. I think what you're sharing, we've talked about, I've said this word a lot, but what you've shared just sounds so so complex for Black men especially. Because on the one hand, there's this desire to use your privilege in a way that is productive, to embody anger in a way that advocates for others, right? Because it makes sense to feel full of rage in the face of injustice, right? That is an appropriate response. But in doing so, you walk this very thin tightrope of not being too angry or too confrontational. And that just sounds like so much to carry with you and sit with from day to day. And so I'm curious about, the impact on your mental health that might have, right? And we've talked about your own mental health journey. And I'm curious how you decided that it was time to sort of take responsibility for that. And if there was anyone who supported you in that decision.
Yeah. It's interesting for me when I think of why I started going to therapy. Finally doing it was my realization I'm a very relational person. Like, we all are relational people. And I think for me, relations really have driven a lot of my life, and also are things that I experience a lot of challenges. I experience a lot of challenges, especially in the most intimate relationships, romantic relationships. I get the most joy from my relationships, especially when I feel helpful, but also I get the most stress when I feel like I'm not being helpful, when I let someone down, right? Not just romantic relationships, but also my colleagues, my friends, like all of that, right? Yeah. And so I started to, right before the pandemic, I had just gone through another breakup, and I felt like I was going through a pattern, like similar type of people are dating, who were more avoidant attachment style, and which caused me to more anxious attachment style, which then caused issues and stuff like that. And so it was, and I actually had, the year before that, I had met a therapist and who recommended another therapist, and so I had someone's number, but it took me a year to actually reach out to them until I was like, you know what? I think I do need to talk to someone, and for me it's a little different because by then I've spent maybe 4 or 5 years working as a yoga teacher, but then become a social emotional learning facilitator, talking about mental health. But I thought for me, I just need communal mental health, being having circles and talking to friends and or doing practices like mindfulness and yoga and etc. Yeah. But I realized then I was actually I do need that higher level of intervention to help me work through what was going on for me, because I knew it was just kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? That there's other things below it, and I'm an overthinker, so it's helpful to have someone outside of my friend and family to talk about that. Because also it allows, for me, I realized I started to have a therapist. There's a space of you don't have to worry about being judged, and so that really was the impetus for me to do that, and it really shifted my thinking around the importance of that for everyone. And really we had to mind a lot of other stuff that I didn't realize. Right?
Yeah. I love that your work gave you this sort of language and frameworks to think about your mental health, and that your overthinking actually kind of benefited you in this situation, right? Because if you weren't naturally so self-reflective and curious, it might have taken you a lot longer to come to that conclusion that it was time to take responsibility for that part of your healing journey. As we close out on that note, I want to ask you, what does it look like when men heal?
I think part of it is that my big thing is that to recognizing for myself that the experience of being a man, experience of masculinity, is very diverse. I think part of healing as men, as masc folks, is this recognition of our intersectionalities and how there is space for all of those, right? I think that's the first thing. There's space for us to be able to feel our wholeness in a way that that heals with each other and allows us to feel accepted with each other, but also be able to heal and inspire to be able to hold each other accountable in a way that doesn't feel dismissive, right? I think there's a difference for me between this idea of cancel culture and healing, right? I think it's really easy to be like, you made a mistake and we'll cancel you, right? Especially as men. Especially as men like us who want to be like progressive and be good allies, it's easy to do that. But it's also a way as a protection, because okay, I'm not like that person. I don't perpetuate those same things.
Right. And the work is kind of done.
Yeah, the work is done. But the recognition is like part of it is that we that whatever that person is also a mirror for ourselves. It's a mirror for ourselves to be like, oh yeah, I maybe not on the biggest scale, but wasn't aware of something. I did something similar. And so it's more about how do we hold ourselves accountable? How do we call in other men to be like, that was part of healing. Is like that was not right, and shouldn't be the onus of women and not non-binary folks to be like to call men out for it, but also to say like, I still see you in your wholeness and recognize, as the great lawyer and death penalty advocate Brian Stevenson says, we're not our worst action, right? We're not defined by worst action. And so can we hold space for that? Can we hold space for each other to be like, hey, you made a mistake. You need to make amends for that mistake, for your own healing, but also we still love you, right? And I think to do that step, to hold space for ourselves, we have to first be able to feel like we can share our emotions. I think the stereotype is, which for better or worse, the generalization is that we as men talk about emotions with the woman or non-male men in our lives, right? Our sisters, our mothers, our spouses, our female friends. And first of all, they shouldn't have to hold the space for all of that. I think that's also like a form of patriarchy.
Right. The expectation is there.
Right? You are here to serve my emotional needs, right? Which is, and honestly, we can serve each other's emotional needs as men, right? And I think that's why I've done these Men of Color circles or yoga for men workshops, right? It's an opportunity for us as men of all different types of men to basically be able to like say like we have a space that we can feel safe to talk about emotions, but also to challenge each other, to be brave, to learn from our mistakes, to grow with each other. So for me, that is what healing is going to take. Healing is going to take us to basically be able to start to be vulnerable, which is a challenge. To be able to hold space that when another male friend of ours is not exactly like us and not think exactly like us, how can we hold space for their version of masculinity? While also holding accountable when that version of masculinity is harmful at times, but also not to judge and say that you're just that. And then last, like it is a collective effort, I think, that needs to start small and eventually grow. So for me, healing is just going to take us to be soft and recognize the power within that softness.
Oh. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself. I just, I love getting the chance to hear you speak so beautifully about these topics that you obviously know a lot about, and just getting to learn and grow alongside you, I think is just also a gift of this like shared experience around masculinity. So thank you so much for sharing everything that you have today, and
Thank you, Kanoa. I appreciate you. And first, I'm not perfect. I recognize it. So
none of us are.
I make a lot of mistakes.
Hey,
but,
let's start. We should have started the conversation with that. None of us are perfect. Nothing we're putting out into the world is perfect. And I think I don't think good and beautiful things get made that way, right? Mm-hmm. Like if perfection were the standard, then I don't think we would have most of the art that we love today, mm-hmm. right? And so we're putting this conversation out in the world because we recognize that there are men in the world that need to hear it, right? There are probably men in the world who are having similar sort of curiosities and wonderings about their relationship to masculinity and to patriarchy, and we are by no means the end-all be-all experts on the subject, but our conversations have been really productive and generative, and speaking for myself, I feel like have gotten me closer to the kind of masculinity that I want to embody. And so I think anything that we can do to bring a few more folks into that process and that fold is worth doing. So perfection is not the goal, the goal. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and stay tuned for the next conversation. We hope that you'll join us then too.